Welcome to the Huffing Spirit Podcast, where we take you from the sacred to the profane, from the serious to the silly, from the outer to the inner, and from the guru back to you. Join your playful podcast guides, Alex Hindley and Natalie Dick, as they bring you back to a grounded and more authentic approach to spirituality.
We're recording. All right, Alex, we are live. We have a very special guest today.
Welcome, Rachel. We are so excited to dive deep with you today. Rachel Smith is on the Huffing Spirit Podcast, and she is a PhD candidate in depth psychology at Pacific Graduate Institute. And she is exploring the intersection of women's voices and the psychological journey of individuation. She's breaking the silence in the psychological literature by empowering women to embrace their sexual experiences and to integrate their wholeness with a modern Jungian perspective. Rachel lives in Asheville, North Carolina with her 3 children and 2 dogs, and currently she edits psychological literature as a book midwife to help bring depth psychology to a wider audience. Rachel, thank you so much for being here.
I can breathe after that little description. It's so much. There's so much in here. I can't wait to unpack who is Rachel. So thank you so much for being on our podcast. We're so honored to have you here.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So do you want to start a little bit with who Rachel is and a stepping stone, where you started, how you got into this, who you are, and you can literally just vomit this out as you can.
Feel free to vomit all over us.
Yeah, you can barf on this podcast. We're so encouraging of that.
Natalie's into that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
On that note,
I'm done here.
yeah, scene. Yeah, that's a great description of probably what I'll do. I spent 6 years in China, and so when I got out of college, my focus was international, and I wanted to live abroad. Wanted to work abroad. I came back for grad school. I was going to return abroad. And then I got derailed. I got married. I stayed here. But I stayed in the international relations space until I had some major health issues. And that was kind of the start of all of this. Yeah. So like a lot of us, we just sort of that total career pivot. And I got into Pilates originally because I really needed my own healing required a lot of body work because I had just been completely in my head and absent from that pretty much my whole life to that point. And so through that, then I started helping other women with issue that I had around chronic pelvic pain and that whole journey. So I went, deep dive into Pilates and then health coaching. But the more you get into that space, it was like I was kind of starting to glitch. People were bringing up things that I was like, I don't have a smoothie recipe for that. That issue is something that's not this is outside my scope. But that was the best part to me. That was the most fascinating part to me. And I wanted to just finally bring everything together under one field of knowledge, I guess. And depth psychology was the only field. And I still feel that way. That brings all the facets of my interest around health and women and psychology and spirituality and personal development and all of this and the body, not losing the body in the process. Yeah. And so that was kind of a COVID thing. It was like, hey, I'm here. They started a hybrid program to allow that. And so I jumped in right at the beginning of COVID. And so it's still evolving and growing and super exciting time to be in depth psychology.
Wow.
Well, and I've found that a lot of psychologists don't get into this type of work as well too. And I've had some friends that are in it and they're like, it's not covering, there's certain lanes that are doing more damage than good, they say.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think anytime you leave something out, right? And so even the reason why I actually chose to stay in the more academic sphere with depth psychology and work on more maybe a cultural level versus going and getting a therapy credential to work one-on-one is that I feel like it's really important out of a respect for the field to continue to criticize it in a generative way and to question it and to say, this is the thing no one's talking about. This is the thing we've left behind. This is how depth psychology that always talks about not being one-sided. This is maybe the small way we're still one-sided. And so just to constantly bring that in. And so the academic sphere for me is perfect for that, versus using it as a tool. I want to help the tool and improve the tool and talk about the tool.
So I have a question, and I want to make sure that our audience knows, what is the difference between psychology and depth psychology?
Simplest answer that I would tell any family member or neighbor that asks is that depth psychology includes the unconscious. And it's a simple way to explain it, but the unconscious by definition is unknowable. So now we're saying, well, this is a psychology about all the stuff we don't know. And it's like, what? And it kind of, we can then start to talk about how the unconscious starts to emerge and pop up in our lives. So whether it's through our bodies, which houses, whether it's through our feelings, whether it's through our dreams, our imagination, when you talk about Freudian slips, those little things that you that just come out of nowhere and you're like, ooh, how did that happen? Or when we get triggered, even those are unconscious things. So even mainstream psychology is talking about this, but they're not all the time kind of crediting it with maybe where it comes, or not as explicitly as depth psychology does. And I think it can be a dangerous space. Jung talked about the unconscious can also be, it's a wild west. It can be dangerous. You don't want to be flooded with unconscious material. If you are flooded with unconscious material, this is psychosis. So we have to find little ways where we're getting little bits to integrate slowly over our lives without being overwhelmed by it. So you have to be careful with it, and you have to treat it with, the due respect it deserves. So it's very powerful.
I love that. And I want to go back to you being a health coach and were you very much in that kind of physical template of fixing yourself and working through your health I have a very similar background, like being a health coach and being in Pilates and yoga. And for your own journey and really unpacking that, where did you kind of specifically keep hitting a wall in your own health where it was like, this is not working?
That's a good question. I think the simplest way to put it would be, I ran into a lot of issues when I deferred to authority to tell me about my body, because the paradigm we have is Western medical model. And it's great. Like, if I need antibiotics, if I need open heart surgery, like all of that, like, thank God I live in this time period. But
right.
I was dealing with something that had an emotional component to it, that I was holding a lot of stuff in my body that was made vulnerable and kind of came out because of childbirth. And so the Western medical model was kind of like, we don't know what to do with you, they suggested, nerve blockers, which is really interesting if you think about symbolically, like, just stop feeling. Okay, Rachel, just take something and stop feeling. Or surgery, remove the thing that's hurting you. So either discard what's hurting you or block it. And all of it just was like, this is not sitting well with me. I want to go deeper into it. And through the help, what was interesting is the actual solution was a marriage of my emotional work, psychological work, but then I also did have a physical therapist who just did physical trigger point release. Like, women's physical therapists are magicians. They're amazing. They're, everyone should have access to them. And so it ended up being all of it, but I did not block it and I did not cut it out. And it hurt more before it got better, just like a lot of things. Like, there are trigger points in your body that they get to just get their thumb in there and release it. So,
and I think that's a really beautiful story, because I feel like everybody kind of comes into that opening through their body. Well, not everybody, but there's opportunity because we work so heavily in the mind and again, look outside of ourselves for that solution, that we just take everything, but everything kind of, it's inside of you, where there's so much depth and information. It's just we've lost the ability to deeply listen to what our body is saying, like this innate intelligence. So I love that story.
And that was the impetus behind the dissertation as well. It was that, as much as I respect Jung's work and Freud's work, and they're men and they're talking about women's experiences, and they're not actually talking that much about it. It's also largely just not talked about. And so what better way to understand these processes as experiential? Jung was an empiricist. It's through women's voices of their own experiences, not what's being told to them, what's being diagnosed, and what's how it's being framed from the outside.
Yeah, I've got a really bad joke that I imagine there's so many female body parts that have been named by a man.
Right?
maybe all of them. But it's fascinating to me, the work that you're doing. And I mean, we've had a few messages back and forth with Instagram, and Rachel's like, just got this wealth of knowledge. Because with this, there's no way to be shallow about depth psychology. So I had like my own kind of preconceived notions of taking this year of a course, and a few questions that I asked her, and she correctly like guided me in a really cool, polite, fun way that gave me more information of like, I think you need to be understanding this aspect from like a mythological thing, and then drawing into like the symbolism of the archetype. Can you get into like archetypes and symbols and like how they play into our everyday life and healing?
Sure. I think it's maybe best to start out with probably the biggest misconception with archetypes is that as depth psychologists, we recognize there's as many archetypal images as there are people that can think them up. And so archetypal images are these highly resonant things within our culture, but they can change and they can morph and they can grow. And you can have modern examples, you can have ancient examples, you can have living examples and examples in nature. What we talk about archetype with capital A is unknowable. And I say that because this is something that it comes from an unconscious place, and it is more like an energy that constellates these images. And so when we go into certain situations, the lover archetype may constellate, and it may look 1,000 different ways, but all those 1,000 different ways are this archetype of connection and communion and union. And so those are, we can talk about like the qualities of this archetype and like how it shows up, but we can't name it. You can't pin it down because it's unknowable. Yeah, we're like almost looking at the outline of it, or we're looking at it. We have to look at it obliquely in order to talk about it.
So you won't see it, but you will see the way that it manifests.
100%. Yeah, that's a better way to say it. Sometimes I've seen certain things on LinkedIn that are like, oh, this company, or like McDonald's is an archetype of this, and you're like equating them so concretely, just like strips away the entire idea of what an archetype actually is. It's way more fluid and way bigger than when we try to distill it down to this is the archetype of,
Right.
And it carries like a power with it, correct?
Yes. Archetypal possession is a thing that we talk about.
I want to get into this. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, because
I wanted to have this, like, one of my questions was, let's dive into archetypal flooding.
Yeah, stuff I study more specifically. The best examples, to chat about casually, if you're going to do that, is when men and women are possessed by the other, I don't want to call it a gender, but like when women are possessed by a masculine archetypal energy, when men are possessed by, because when you're in a possession, it's completely unconscious. And so it's not really generative anymore, right? So Jung talks a lot more about women, of course, being possessed by the masculine energy. And that is when we become kind of, instead of being in a balanced masculine energy, which would be like discernment, we're getting clarity,
Awareness.
Structure, like we have this thing going into the possession of it or the unconscious aspects of it. It's when we become highly critical and what is that word, like rigid, kind of in our heads way too much, overly competitive, like
Forceful.
yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of those qualities obviously like universally aren't great and aren't attractive, but particularly to men in a relationship can just be like, ugh, like really off-putting. And the opposite is true too. Men get flooded by a feminine energy that is the shadowy side of it, the not like, we want them in touch feelings, we want them to have a fluidity, we want men to be able to nurture. And this side, the possessive side of that is moodiness, like when the emotions are controlling you, or this inability to live in a structure or make up your mind, like indecisiveness and moodiness, I would say would come up. And if you ask any woman, they're like, that drives me nuts when my man's super indecisive or super moody, because it's not only not a masculine energy, because we'd like a balance between them and everybody, male and female, but it's the shadowy side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was listening to. Are you familiar with like Robert Moore? So he was talking about how powerful they can be, but you're playing with this like high voltage God energy as well too. So there's kind of a line of balancing and understanding that archetype so that you can utilize it for greater manifestation of energy and healing, as they're all trying to do. And then there's the shadow side of it too, where you're playing with 50,000 volts.
Right.
Flooding.
Yeah. You can't do a whole lot if you're drinking from a fire hose, right? You need to kind of find a way to work with it. And this happens early on in relationships too. You're just like, wow, the chemistry that, this is so amazing. And Jung would say that the type of person he doesn't want to work with in therapy because they're truly crazy are people who are in love, like brand new in love, because he's like, I can't help you. You're so like, calm down, like let's let the first 3 months go by, kind of a thing. Then we can start to work with love. Then we can start to like be more generative versus
I want to go back to the flooding of this, like whether it's like feminine shadow or masculine shadow within men and women. How do you see that flooding of masculine energy implicate women's health?
So many ways.
Mm-hmm.
I can probably speak more personally to that when you, well, and it's personal and it's also not, because all of us are just way more in the masculine than we need to be, women. And there's a certain, it's being cut off from your feeling function. And that is so, for me, is housed so deeply in what makes me a woman. And so when that's cut off because you are so in your masculine, you are then cut off from a really generative part of yourself. And when you're trying to, like, when we talk about the physical body, you're trying to just hold yourself together, so and not like opening up and being more fluid, which is a more feminine kind of state. When you're just holding on for dear life, going at a faster pace, doing, not being, that results in just muscle tension. Like at the end of the day, like chronic pelvic pain is complex, but a huge percentage of it is just muscle tension that needs to be let go. And how do you just it is a tension holding pattern, and you're not letting go because you don't feel safe to do so. And it's a little bit of a critique of our culture, but it's also just, you don't feel safe within yourself. It's never been an accepted thing. And so it directly plays into women's health.
Yeah. And I have a very similar experience. I used to work in corporate, and was my whole life. That's kind of how I tilted and moved into the work I'm doing, is similar trajectory, very masculine, pushed, traveled a lot for work, couldn't settle into the feeling part of me. So my feelings actually ran me unconscious. Like they came in unconsciously, very volatile in my moods, literally couldn't relax, didn't know how to relax, had no safety and vulnerability. And I was my health and my hormones, like I was told I would never have a baby. I'm broke. And that's like for me, that was my body's way of saying like, hey, you can operate like in this very masculine structured way. And I catch myself in this very thick conditioning to soften, come back. And I mean, it's been such a transformational, probably like 10 years, but it's deep work to soften and be vulnerable. Like it took me a long time to get to that place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Alex was asking earlier about the difference between more mainstream psychology and depth. And I would say, for me, something that stands out and is important is just because of our whole, the way the whole medical system's set up. It's like, we got to diagnose, we have to label this, we have to, we end up needing to pathologize it a little bit. And depth psychology comes at it from a completely different side of, the second we pathologize it, we sort of moralize it, and we decide that this isn't a state you should be feeling. Like, let's get you out of this depression. How can we get you out of anxieties? And obviously they're uncomfortable states. Like, yeah, I'm never going to invite a panic attack back in my life. Like, I don't welcome it. But at the same time, when it happens, or if it happens, like you said, this is the body finally raising its hand and going, like, I'm a board member here, I have a vote, I need to scream at you to get you to listen to me. But it ends up happening. And then we can, instead of pathologizing it, is when we finally ask the question, oh, what did you need? Is there something you needed to tell me? And talk to it as if it's just another aspect of it, because it is. And depth psychology is fantastic for that.
Would you say, like, in a roundabout way, depth psychology is in the allowance of like this expression versus typical psychology, traditional, is more like labeling and suppressing?
Yeah. I mean, could we even say it's a little more masculine in that way? It fits into our culture. So it wants to categorize and it wants to label. Complexities I love around Jung is that he was also a man of his times. And he said a whole bunch of stuff that pissed women off. And so no one would directly just say, oh yeah, he's a total feminist. But his entire work is about bringing the feminine principle back. And so, Dr. Susan Rowland, who's actually my dissertation chair, is like, he's the most unlikely feminist, but there's an argument to be made that he's completely a feminist. And I love that.
I could totally see it, but somebody's like, he had multiple girlfriends and, like sleeping with his clients, like very, very female body positivity.
Right. Let's call it that. Not the most straightforward argument to make, but it's, if you talk about it as an energy and a movement and a balance of the psyche and how we are overly masculine, depth psychology kind of represents recognizing and finding and bringing a feminine sensibility back into our lives, which is, I think of it more like if a child came to you, your child, and says, I'm feeling sad, how would a mother respond? They wouldn't say, well, it sounds like you have depression. The mom would say, let me give you a hug. Let's talk about this. Let's, figure it out.
It's something Natalie and I talked a lot about too, because we're both kind of on the, there's the top-down approach, the psychological, and then there's the feeling, letting it go through the body, doing the body work to open it up, to de-armor, so I've been studying Reich, disciple of Freud, Lowen, bioenergetics, and there is something to be said about it. I mean, I've had some of these experiences where you're doing this body work, and after breathing and doing the body work for 45 minutes, it feels like you took psychedelics.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And the wisdom that your body has, but like I'm glad more people are saying it, but it's not something that you hear as a kid, of
Definitely
just
not.
listen to your body.
Definitely not our parents' paradigm of parenting. That was like,
No.
what, you're feeling something? Go over there. We're not dealing with it.
I need to take this fucking kid to the doctor. They're having too many feelings.
Yeah. No. And I love the bottom up approach. I mean, that's all of my work is just getting women to deeply understand like what's happening in the internal landscape and really trusting that. And I always like to see it as the body being the feminine, and the it's like these crashing waves of expression through our emotions, and allowing that expression to be without putting the narrative around it, which is the masculine. The masculine is like the linear sequencing of the feeling, where it's like we need to just allow our bodies to have this feeling, and the masculine is important too, but can we just allow this thrashing about to exist within us and give it a place? Can we just give it a place to be?
Yeah. And that right away conjures so much compassion I have for men who externally present as masculine and there's societal expectations for them to be so masculine. So if women don't even feel like we can be in that feeling state, you can only imagine either the disconnect or the shame or whatever it is for men to feel like they have permission to also have that state. It's a sad state of affairs. I mean, they feel for men right now. Mm-hmm.
Well, especially with like the Sigma grind mentality that's all over social media. I think that's going to burn out soon. You know,
it's dying. It's got to die. It's just, it's got to die.
And some days I'm like, I went to the grocery store. That's a fucking accomplishment. You know?
Yeah. And going back to men, like I 100% agree with you. Like, I feel like men are really struggling with this, not knowing how to allow themselves to feel, because they're so constricted and everything is so mind-based. Like, they have no connection to the body, and lo and behold, if they do have connection, it's like the floodgates open, and what's in there? Like, what's actually in there? Like, millennia of rage. Like, I get men would be so fearful to feel. That is a scary place for men to feel.
Yeah. And there's a lot of talk around, and I understand this because of our history. There's the conversation around women not feeling safe around men, but perhaps we can also say men don't feel safe within themselves. Like, what is wanting to emerge or come from, it's constantly like pressing it down, or having to contend with that, and then feel like they can't express it, or that it's big enough. When feelings get so big, they feel destructive, and that's not, you have to be in a really safe place to be able to go there.
And there has been no safety for men to go there.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think as a guy too, you're worried about once it opens up. I mean, there's it in some ways, and I'm speaking as a man and as a white man, and I, hear conservatives in my family, like I could see where it feels like the walls are kind of closing in, where you're like, there's no space to be a man anymore. You can't just think out loud. You can't, like, you're kind of put into this box, and it has to be this high functioning, productive, you have to be able to do it all. And I'm really thankful to the men's groups I've been able to witness and be part of, where they give men the space for that. And there's people that are like, yeah, I don't know if I need to build a community or make it bigger. And every time they do, more men show up because they need that space.
I love that men are having men's groups like that. For me, that's so hard.
Right?
So
keep it in your pants a little bit, all right?
Well, no, but I think it's like, when I hear about men going to men's groups, I'm like, That's hot.
Tell me more.
Tell me more. Tell me more about your men's groups.
Tell me about your grunting and shaking with men.
Like, tell me about your primal expression and what's coming out of you. I'm like, I want to know. Like, well, I don't want to know about it, but I think like when I hear about a man getting in touch with his feelings in the way that man is meant to, for him, in safety with other men, that is so beautiful. So beautiful, because women we're not meant to hold men in a way emotionally. That's meant for them to do in a different way. We're so different. Yeah. Anyway, that's my thoughts on it. I think it's very hot.
We got that.
Ovaries are just, yeah,
my ovaries are like ding, ding, ding,
like
ding.
like Christmas lights just flaring in there.
Yeah.
I'm normally the one that sidetracks this. You did a great job on that one, Natalie.
Yeah, I'm just being honest. And so, Rachel, for you, like when you think about like women's journeys back into their body and getting in touch with their emotion and their, I guess, path of healing, what are some of the most beautiful ways that women are doing it?
And what do you think are some of the blocks that have stopped them from healing?
Yeah.
The place I would start is by saying women need space to be able to do it. Like, we are the vessel, we are the container. We don't even really know that. And so we have to intentionally create that space. We have to pause. We have to slow down. We have to, for me, it was really, really hard, and I still struggle with it, with sitting and doing and not feeling guilty about it. Because when you create that space, the image that I used for years out of an I Ching role that I did was the deep well. And it's like, if you create a space and you just allow it to be, something's going to come up from the well. And it's going to be you. And it's going to be the thing that is, I guess, least informed by outside forces. So this is sort of the essence of who you are. But nothing can emerge from that space and well up within you without it. Like we have so many distractions right now, and the speed of everything goes so fast. And to start some sort of practice where you are just putting everything on pause and giving it that space, I think I have been surprised with what's come up, and I think that's probably a pretty common experience, because this is in depth psychology what we call the self, and this is sort of a divine part of us that is, it has its own goals and teleology for this life and how it wants to be known and what it wants to hold. And it's not from our conscious ego perspective. This is something that I'd say almost a good litmus test is that you're surprised by.
I love that. That's a really beautiful description, and that's, I mean, pretty damn close to the work that I'm teaching women. Is there's such a universe in here. Like there's so much information in here. If you could just tune in and listen. And it's not for me to tell you how to understand your body. That's a subjective journey, and one that is so rich in tapestry and information that if you can just stop with this external world, which is so intensely distracting, and hear yourself and hear your body and how it wants to communicate with you, like it's like gold in there.
Mm-hmm.
So much, and darkness, and scary shit.
There's a few shadow caves in there too.
There's some shitty things in there, but all of it is gold, right?
Demonic gold sometimes.
Yeah,
and the distractions are not just entertaining. Like, I'm okay if we need to unplug and be entertained and laugh and whatever. That is not what we're talking about. I'm almost more concerned with distractions that are other people's voices telling us and informing us and shaping us, because that's been the long range problem in my mind. And kind of behind my work now is starting to, on one hand, it's a masculine skill to be able to discern, but you're discerning in order to make room for, an inner feminine voice and feeling to come up from within you, and not what society has told you. Because when we say society, it sounds like it's everybody, it's men.
It's what systems are in control that have shaped
right.
all of our opinions and thoughts, and that conditioning is thick. And you feel that within yourself. You're like, oh, I subscribe to that belief, but that was never mine.
Right. Well, in case men haven't said it, you're welcome.
I'm done. Where do I log off? Thank you.
No, I mean, there's so many things that we've done that have just been messed up, and I think I once had a conversation with somebody where they said, well, okay, how do you fix this? And I said, stop trying to think you have to fix anything. Just listen to another person and be empathetic. The idea that you think you could fix somebody or the situation within them is just so grandiose. So I think the systems, but also like just the idea that you always have to be doing is part of the main thing that's breaking people. And this idea, perhaps masculine, that you have to go outside of yourself to get it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not within you.
And the masculine is it's seeking, right? It is the seeking, and the feminine, we just sit and we be. But allowing that, I don't know, for me, the way I see this new era of where we're moving into this, the feminine divine is really coming online into all of us, and it is rocking everybody right now. Like, I feel like the world is just getting completely flipped upside down because there's been such an imbalance. The balance is trying to recorrect itself.
Sure. And it's going to bring up its own new challenges. And that's why I always want to keep one foot in the camp of discernment, because we don't need a slew of a chaotic void of, feminine nature. We need both. And, to be clear, when we say this is not just men doing this, these are women who are informed and are just as masculine sometimes, if not more than men, who are also contributing to it. So this is not, a man versus woman thing. This is just an overall rebalancing that we're right in the midst of.
Do you feel that there's because Natalie and I have talked about it, and I don't want to shoehorn you into this with the question, but do you feel that there's a collective shadow that's kind of being exposed right now? And how do you maintain your hope in all of the shadows that are coming out?
Anytime anything is conscious, there's always going to be a shadow. It's unavoidable. And it's not like an ominous thing. It's more like, well, this is just how it is. And it's necessary. If you think about light, literally, if you have no shadow, it means you have no direct light on anything. So we're not able to make anything conscious. We need to talk about these things and have them be very conscious so we can work with them, and understanding all the while that while we are doing it, it's generating a shadow. And so the work is constantly to be in the conscious, work in the conscious, because this is what we know, and then to turn our head or allow the shadows to shift and shape and to bring some of the shadow into light. And when we do that, other things are going to go by the wayside. We can't keep, we can't keep everything, because it's just a cosmological reality is the best way to say it. There's just, it just is what it is, but it doesn't need to be bad. If we're so focused and our consciousness is so much on a ton of negativity, or if we have labeled someone as that, the shadowy aspects of that person are going to be that they're sweet, kind, generous, loving, that's their shadow. So
Awesome. I want to dive quickly into one of the topics that you want to talk about, and that's what's on the other side of something difficult when we lean into
Good. I'm glad we're getting to
the
this.
opposite. I love this, and I love like how shame breaks through into self-acceptance, pain to joy, grief into love, fear into courage. Can we open that up? Because I love dancing in that.
It's one of my favorite terms, and it's also one of my least favorite terms because I can't spell it. But the term is Enantiodromia, and what?
That was our
Feels
word
like a
for class.
touchdown.
That was
Oh,
our
is
word
it?
for class. So
Yeah.
we did the 3-year class, and he said the name for our word for class was Enantiodromia.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We're still
Which
not
is
gonna spell it.
amazing that we know that word. I'm really surprised that we know that word. Like we're both like, yes.
I think I understand it, and then here I'm going to show my ignorance again.
We'll let Rachel unpack that.
The definition is really simple. The more you go in one direction, you're eventually going to hit the other. And yeah, now that I say that, it's probably more abstract, but it's think about it like this. This is a really crude example. I don't know why this came to mind. The more in Christianity, like we focus on purity and morality and all of this stuff, and you start going that direction, what inevitably ends up happening? Like some really fucked up shit.
Yeah.
It's just true. Like I'm not making this up.
Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing.
Yeah, it's like the more you lean in and focusing on being pure, the dark, filthy parts of that sexual experience, the shadow side of it is going to be like, hey.
Yeah, because it takes so much psychic energy to push stuff away, and right, and so if you just reject it completely and you're just like, I am the holiest of holies, and I have so much power in this, and there is so much purity and righteousness and everything, you after a while, like it's a door that you're having to like shut. There's things that are wanting to come out of that door, and you have to spend a lot of energy pushing that, and it just, instead of politely going away, the psyche wants balance, the universe wants balance, and that stuff's gonna come out of the door and hit you. And that's a lot of times it comes up negatively, but it's also can be so healing, right? And so when we are I'm doing this because I'm like trying to stay in our head and we're trying to shove down feelings, they're going to rear themselves up they're going to come in the back door somehow. But if you can
they'll kick it in.
Yeah. But if you can like go there, and it takes so much courage and bravery, but if you can go there, it finds a different kind of balance that is not combative and like each trying to vie for consciousness, but an integration of the two.
I have so many examples in my life.
And that's what we can call that's what we can call archetypal, right? It's like we can talk about this thing from we have all these different examples, and we kind of don't know what we're talking about. And we did put a word to it, but we're still just kind of, finger painting with it.
I love it.
Finger painting with Jung.
Yeah.
I think that's the episode name.
Yeah.
I have a question about your dissertation and how you're bringing women's libidinal experiences into depth psychology. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, on one
also,
hand, I'm saying it doesn't exist, right? I'm saying there aren't any, and then I'm saying, and I'm going to study them. So that kind of is contradicting. So what I'm having to do is setting up a ton of theory of what we say this process of individuation and personal development and growing and how the self emerges from us and all this, and then saying, but we don't have any women talking about where that intersects with their sexuality. But luckily there's so much out there in the world of poetry and essay and diary, and even case studies to a certain extent where the women are, quoted and given a chance to talk about their own experiences. So there's actually a ton of data out there. It's like bringing it into depth psychology now because it's been not treated in a depth psychological way. So that's the task at hand.
I love that. And how has that landed for, has there been resistance in bringing that forth?
No, I think the main response so far, and it's because it's still in process, has largely just been within the core faculty and my cohort, is that it's one of those things, one of my professors said, it's one of those things where you sit back and nobody really knew that we weren't talking about it until somebody just raised their hand and said, what about this? And yeah, it just kind of starts as an innocent inquiry, just because I was looking for something from a depth psychological perspective that reflected my own experience, and I didn't find it, and was like, okay, and I wrote about it a little bit with my own experience, and I was like, I think this needs to be a bigger body of work. And the suggestion was, this almost sounds like a genre within depth psychology, which is women's sexuality and their personal development, because there is no textbook for it. There is nothing out there. So
how cool that you get to bring it forth, though.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you look back on your life's journey and you're like, that was one of the hardest and worst things I ever went through, and so rich. It is the only reason why now I have kind of moved into this space. So it's hard to be thankful in the moment. It's only in hindsight that you're kind of like,
oh, that's why that happened.
Yeah.
And you take that pain and you turn it into joy and education and insight for so many.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I want to think that everyone ends up having experiences in their life that challenges them or provides them the opportunity to contribute to everybody's growth. And, if you think about your life and your experiences, negative or positive, and, as little breadcrumbs, might be a nice way to live life. I don't know.
Yeah. Sounds lovely. I love that. Alex, I cut you off.
No, I was going to ask my fun question.
What was the fun question?
So for your life, your whole experience, whether we're talking depth psychology, living abroad, or anything, is there a question you wish people would ask you? Because sometimes you have trapped knowledge that, you're like, I just wish somebody would ask me how I design a spaceship. No one ever does.
That's a good question. I don't know. I feel like there isn't anything burning. I think it's enough of an ask to be like, can we just talk about my dissertation? Because I'm really excited about it.
Yeah,
I feel like that's asking a little much, just because I see how people's eyes glaze over if I get into anything, and that's normal. We joke about it all the time, but yeah, I might be asking for too much for more than that.
So can you articulate then, because you were talking about archetypal self with a big A, right? And then you were saying the archetypal self, right? That's self with a big S. So can you differentiate that for people of here's the difference between self with a small s and what happens when you come into self contact with self with a big S?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Self with a lowercase s, I think, can be used in so many different, you can't even really define it because it's used in so many different ways, but capital S self is one of the harder things to describe just because it's really abstract. And there's been people talk about maps of the psyche where it's almost like topography, where you can kind of describe where the ego sits and where shadow sits and persona and all this stuff. And the self is tricky because it is at the same time. So we're just going to talk in paradoxes and scramble our brains at the same.
We can hold multiple truths. We're cool with that.
We're game. Let's do it.
Let's do it. It's the center of gravity for where I should say it's not the center. The ego is the center of gravity, but as we age and where where we're trying to go is shifting the center of gravity from ego to self more. Sometimes I talk about the ego self axis. We kind of move along this where it's like the only thing we know, the only thing we believe is what's conscious. And at that midlife point, part of the crises is that that no longer works. And we're sort of moving further along the line to a new center of gravity in our old age that is based around the self. So it is at once the center of gravity that, we're moving towards, and it is the totality. So it's the outside, it holds everything. And so there are hugely unconscious parts of the self. And, where Jung and Freud started to kind of differentiate themselves was that Freud he had all along sort of a spiritual complex. It was like, no, this is BS. And Jung's like, I think there's something to this, like this self. And one way you can describe it is it's a God image within. And so instead of looking outwards to Christianity or whatever for these images of the divine, the self encompasses our own image of the divine. And so it is sort of, when we're talking about listening to the self, this is, a guide. This is a divine aspect of ourselves. So again, if you think about this field as hard science, you're going to run into problems because it's not that really minimizes it quite a bit. It's an art and a science, and it has a ton of spiritual components to it. And so one has to be okay with that in order to be okay with Jung. And so, that's why we've kind of stayed a smaller community, because the world's maybe not ready for that, to have it all.
Because you can't quantify it. It's subjective.
Yeah. It's like every indigenous culture, they have like 1 foot a shaman in the spiritual realm, and then 1 foot in physical reality. But it's really hard to be in both at the same time. It's like flipping back and forth, because the one space is infinite and tangible, subjective, and the other is concrete.
And it takes a ton of grounding in ethics, really, to be able to hold so much ambiguity. You have to be able to talk about these things and talk through everything, because we cannot, this is not conducive to headlines and buzzwords and being really reduced down. And I mean, that's the struggle that I've been talking more and more with people lately, is they're like, we just want Jung simplified. We just speak English. And I'm like, I'm trying. It's just so hard the second you start trying to put it into these neat packages of knowledge that we have through every other medium that we read and learn, it's qualitatively reduced. And so it's a big challenge.
I think you do a great job. The posts you make are very understanding. There's nothing you're saying here that I'm like, whoa, that's way over my head. I think you're using a very grounded language to something that could be very ethereal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't always get that feedback.
I mean,
send them my way.
But it's also, Alex, like we're
cool fucking people.
Well,
we know what's going on.
We're all cool people. Let's be real. But I mean, this is familiar stuff for us. But for people who are very much in the physical world and the material world, who are reductionist in their scientific approach, this is like, I don't have any footing or grounding for this. I don't. It's like a different language.
Yeah, and we're all. It's really funny of me to speak for everyone. We're all, but I do feel like we have so much coming out. There's so much complexity now. I'm always seeing things, hearing things, bombarded with stuff that I don't even want to know about. Yep. And I think in general that we're all just sort of saturated with stimulation and information. And so it's a big ask to then ask people to stay open with really ambiguous, big topics. Like we all just, it's like, just give me a little certainty. Just tell me how it is in really simple terms, and just I'll follow that. And like, I think it's just human nature in our modern culture to just be a little bit like fatigued with everything.
And a lot of people, I think, are just like, they want to be parented in a lot of the ways that, and they just tell me what to do, because I don't know what to do anymore. That overwhelm.
Well, we're doing so many more micro decisions every day that, you know, like you're just wearing out your bandwidth. And, you know, I think of our human experiences, we've got this very dated brain, but we keep updating the software, and you're like,
right, totally.
You know, it's like my computer from 30 years ago, and you're like, just update the software, and you're like, you need a whole fucking new hardware on this thing.
Right. Right.
So Rachel, a big part of this podcast and everything that Alex and I do in our work and what we've kind of been taught is that we always want to bring people back to themselves. And I mean, our whole discussion is about the internal landscape. So what is one little tidbit that you could give our audience, a little practice or something where they could learn about themselves?
Sure. I have a couple. I'm trying to decide which one would be better. I think I'll go with this one. So I think we were talking earlier about being guarded, and it is necessary to go through life with a little bit of armor. I think where it becomes problematic is when we can't turn it on and off. It becomes part of our body or part of our personality. And it's like a movement pattern that we can't get out of. And I think for me, at the core of health, this word health is just really, loaded. But for me is it's all about functional. So functional movement, functional nutrition. How can you do what you want to do in your life with your health? And it's a different barometer as to like how you should look or what you should weigh, or can you do what you want to do? And so I would challenge people to notice where sort of the limits of points of tension in their body are, because that is also a point of rigidity and something we're protecting. Sometimes we've had these for like decades, and everybody knows what their thing is. And to sit at that point of getting into it physically, and relaxing into it, like having a dialogue with it, relaxing into it, pushing it a bit. You can do it multiple times a day. I'll give an example. So when I was working through the chronic pelvic pain, I realized how much even just surrounding it was locking it in. It wasn't just the pelvis itself. It was my hips and my groin and my adductors. And it was like low back, glutes, everything had kind of been holding it in place. So part of it was just unlocking so many different things. And one thing I knew I could not get into was a deep squat, when your heels are all the way down. If you are in a deep squat. So for women, that's a really, I would say, not welcome position to be in, right? You're sort of like, we don't see this a lot. Women don't pose in this position. It's not something that a lot of women feel comfortable doing. And every day, I had to start with my heels really high because everything was tight. And I just sat with it. Anytime I was using the microwave, the oven, and you let the dogs out and you have to wait for a couple of minutes, like you have these little tiny moments in time, and to just reconnect with that point of tension and feel it day in and day out, and then feel when it starts to budge, and feel your psychology change when your body starts to change. Like when I could finally get into that deep squat, and I could hang out there all day now in that, and it was so opening, and it's actually such a really empowering, it's a birthing pose. It's so connected to my feminine strength, and now I can actually get into it. Like I couldn't even physically get into it with my body, so how could I have ever gotten into it with my mind as well. And so whatever that is, whether it's your neck or your hips or that thing, like, don't injure yourself, but there's parts that you can open up, and we all know what those are. We kind of keep protecting them, and we don't go there, and we're like, I don't want to deal with it. And I think it's very psychological. So one thing to try.
I love that.
That's great. That's easy to do.
Yeah.
You were saying throughout the day as well too, when you're just doing your little stuff. And I think that's the big difference too, is just you're making the unconscious conscious. You're bringing more energy to it.
And it's too much if you sat in that for 90 minutes a day. Like, I think we've weighed so much of our physical health on these big things. And it's like, no, I mean, if you really got into that for 90 seconds, 3 times a day, you would see so much more opening up of these different parts of your body than if you just, slammed a 90-minute workout.
Yeah, you're blasting it open versus following the breadcrumb trail, following the story that your body's like, hey, go over here, go over here, go over here.
The feminine approach.
The feminine approach. Yeah.
Love it.
Awesome. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Where can our listeners find you?
It's probably easiest through Instagram. So it's beautiful.myth. And then I've got a link there.
Perfect. We'll share everything in our show notes about you. Thank you.
This was amazing. Thank you. I have a million questions more.
I know. I feel like we might have to have like part 2 with Rachel, like, because there's a lot of things that we didn't cover, but we'll leave that for the next episode with Rachel. I feel like we're going to have you back big time.
Yeah, I feel like this was a good intro to depth psychology. So we'll go, we'll have different levels of depth for depth psychology.
Deeper next time.
Do it.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Huffing Spirit Podcast. Remember, you are your own teacher. Take what resonates and leave the rest. For more info, follow us on Instagram at Huffing Spirit Podcast and subscribe on Spotify or iTunes. Bye for now.